Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure is a SNES and Genesis sequel to the Atari platforming game classic, where you play as the original Pitfall Harry's son, trying to save him from a mysterious kidnapping. That's more plot than you get in most games of this era, and this intro cinematic is a bit of a novelty for the time too. But that's all the plot you get. There's 10 levels of jungles, caves and ruins, and you're going to have to fight your way through enemies and obstacles with your trusty whip, which never runs out of ammo, or boomerangs, rocks and explosives, which sadly do have limited ammunition you pick up through the levels. The animations are beautiful, but this comes at a price. Since it takes our protagonist several frames to slide to a halt, he's difficult to precisely control, and his jumps are very committed. He's a very heavy boy. Once you've jumped, you can't change direction mid-jump. The levels might seem like mazes, but they're mostly disguised linear paths from A to B, with a few secret areas off to the side that reward you, mostly with ammo. The second half of the levels are sadly just nighttime remixes of the first half, which is a little unimaginative. There's an impressive range of obstacles. Few things are one-off events, so all the obstacles get to be used in interesting combinations later on, making things a lot more difficult. Your moveset is similarly impressive, with jumping, climbing, pushing, grabbing ropes. It's not quite Tomb Raider, but it's getting there. Obstacles that move from the background into the foreground look really impressive on these old consoles, but they're really hard to judge when they are able to hit you or not hit you. There can be spikes which jut out from the background and then come back in, or pendulums which swing from the background into the foreground and you have to run when they're not in the middle ground our player's on, and it's hard to tell when they are in that middle ground visually. Also, going into the background on platforms is, or was at the time, impressive to look at, but it makes it hard to judge what platforms you can stand on, what ground you're on. Are we in the foreground or the background right now? The game is incredibly slow, sadly. It forces you to wait far too long for many things. Moving platforms, platforms that go in and out of walls, platforms that are moving on water, quicksand pits that appear and disappear, those 3D pendulums which come from the background to the foreground. They all take way too long to move. I was occasionally stumped in the levels. For example, when there's a lever hidden behind the foreground, or when there's a spring hidden behind something in the foreground, or when there's a rope hidden behind something in the foreground. I've got to say, hiding things that you need to interact with to finish the level behind a foreground piece of camouflage is bad game design. I'm glad games have stopped doing that for the most part. The inclusion of the original Atari Pitfall as a bonus level that you can access is a nice touch, as are the modern renditions, well, for a 16-bit era at least, of the traps encountered in the Atari Classic. You'll have to jump on crocodiles when their mouths are closed and not open, for example, or grab a vine that lets you swing over a quicksand pit that opens and closes. I recommend the original Atari game, it's quite fun. Being a 90s game, there is an accursed minecart riding minigame. Thankfully, it's short and not too hard, but I still have to curse Indiana Jones for plaguing 90s platformers with those things. Items are often held in jars, which you need to break open to get the health item or the ammo. Unfortunately, some of these are trapped, which is very annoying, as the only way to know which is trapped and which isn't is trial and error. I think the generous health bar this game gives you don't die in one hit thankfully, is an unfortunate thing, as it allows the devs to put enemies in your path that it's very difficult to avoid taking some damage from, and they when they're playtesting it, they're not going to remove those enemies the way they would if the enemy killed you instantly and it was just as hard to remove. They probably think, oh, it's okay if you tank a little bit of damage, and maybe that makes the game a bit more fun, that you sometimes take damage when you're playing it, unless you're like a really good player. However, I don't particularly like it. The generous checkpoints throughout the levels, which do help ameliorate any maze-like features of the game by pointing you in the direction you're supposed to move, might also contribute to the game devs allowing things to be a bit too hard sometimes, or hard in an annoying way. Because, well, you're just gonna reset at the checkpoint when you die. It's not like you've got to start the whole level again. When you hit an enemy, they're not knocked back, unlike in some games. In fact, they have some invincibility frames, which is quite annoying, as they can move during this and move into you, and then when they're no longer invincible, they can hurt you. And your very slow movement speed, as I've said, with a heavy boy, makes it very difficult to dodge enemies. Once we've committed to swinging our whip, we're swinging it for like a good second or two, so, well, it's probably like half a second, but it's enough time for the enemy to like move into us, especially if the enemy is in its invincibility mode. Most enemies need multiple hits to kill. If you use range attacks more, this wouldn't be an issue, but I was very worried about running out of ammo, so I didn't use much ranged attacks. I usually used the whip in the game. So maybe if I'd used my stones, the game would have been easier, but if you're up close and personal with enemies, they can run into you. Turning around if an enemy has got behind you, because when they're in their invincibility pose, they can just move through you, or even, well, just generally, they can just move through you, you take damage, and they're now behind you, and you're attacking forward, you attack in the direction you're facing. So if you try to face them when they're behind you, unfortunately, you'll usually move a bit when you try and turn around, and so you'll probably move into the enemy that's behind you and take some damage. So it's a bit difficult with the clunky controls with his weight to do combat up close and personal, and you're afraid, at least I'm afraid, to do ranged attacks because you're likely to run out of ammo. It can also be difficult to judge how close you can get to enemies when you're trying to whip them without the enemy being able to hit you. And there are some enemies that it really doesn't seem like you can get to their hitbox with your melee weapon, but you need to kill those enemies. So that makes me especially worried about running out of ammunition, because you need to kill these enemies, and it seems very difficult to attack them with a whip. I'm a bit afraid you might be able to softlock yourself. Your bullets can also only hurt enemies that are on screen, and sometimes an enemy will be charging you from off screen. You know it's coming, but you've got to wait for it to appear on screen, so you can throw your rock or your boomerang or what have you at it. This is especially annoying with the bosses. Flying enemies are incredibly annoying too. I don't know how you're supposed to fight them without taking damage, as you can't aim upwards with any of your attacks, and they swoop down on you from above. Perhaps using the explosives could kill them, but I saved all of those because you need explosives to access secret areas. There's doors with cobwebs in front of them that you need to burn off, and the only way I could find to do that was with these explosive rocks, so I kept them to get to secret areas and get more explosive rocks that I wasn't going to use except to access secret areas. There is quite a variety of normal enemies, and that's nice, but all the bosses except for the final boss are just variations on the same Jaguar enemy. The first time you fight a single Jaguar, which is the thing that charges you from off screen, that I actually did use ammunition on. I'm not going to get up close and personal with a Jaguar. The second boss fight is 2 Jaguars at a time. Very difficult. Third is just a single Jaguar, but with an extra instant death move. It's actually easier than fighting 2 Jaguars at once. The final boss is at least unique, but Sadly, I have no clue how you're supposed to defeat these with just the whip. I have no clue. Like, it's very difficult to just shoot them with a ranged weapon and then jump over them without them attacking you. So getting close enough to hit them with a whip seems impossible. Which is why I don't think I would have been able to complete the game if I wasn't conserving ammo the way I did. And the worst thing about the ammo in this game, if you die, there are checkpoints everywhere, but if you die, all your ammo goes down to 0. Well, the rocks do. The boomerangs and the explosives, which are very rare, those remain, but your little rocks, they drop down to 0, and if you're in for a boss, that's not going to give you a good time. For whatever reason, the game doesn't allow you to pause. It's the only time I've seen this in a Genesis game, as the start button is used to select what ammo type you have. There's also a joke in the ending cutscene. Yeah, there's an ending cutscene too. Also quite rare for an old game like this, which actually had me laughing out loud. Maybe I was a bit tired after playing through the game, but I'll give the game kudos for that. So yeah, it's an extremely well-presented game. Music's fine, but the graphics are great for the age. Not sure if that matters nowadays, but the gameplay suffers a little because of that. It's an okay game though. I mean, it's quite good actually, but it does have its flaws. And that's Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure.